The Mitta Mitta is one of the more interesting and more astounding catchments that I actually did historical research on. The Mitta Mitta's up in northeast Victoria. It has the Omeo Plains, some of the highest grazed country in the state, regular snowfalls. Fishing Inspector Jack Rhodes had one anecdote from the upper Mitta Mitta River, and it was about a man he called Grandpa Pendergast, who he interviewed. He was in his 90s in Wodonga back in the 1960s. And Grandpa Pendergast, who lived at Benambra, talked about how he used to go out with a horse and dray up to the big river, which is well upstream in the catchment, almost the snow line. And he used to go out, and in one night he could get all the blue nose, cod and white-eyed bream he wanted and set off home before dawn. That story was almost unbelievable, that there was cod and perch at those sorts of altitudes in Victoria, because you're talking about 700, 800, 900 metres above sea level. And Jack said, "I've lost all the other notes, I haven't got them. What can you find out about the Mitta Mitta River?" The Mitta Mitta was also known as one place that trout cod were found in Victoria into the 1970s. 3 specimens were caught in a survey when they were building the Dartmouth Dam, and they were the only ones known from the catchment. So the first piece of the jigsaw was a newspaper article in the Omeo Standard, and it was reminiscing how in the early days of Omeo there was cod and perch caught in the Livingston Creek in the middle of Omeo, and they could be seen disporting themselves by the hundreds in the holes in the creek before the miners ruined it. So that validated the stories. There were cod and bream at 800 metres above sea level in Victoria. The question was, what was the cod? Were they Murray cod or trout cod? Because Grandpa Pendergast talked about them being blue-nosed cod, but we needed proof. So the cod had been gone from those areas since the early 1900s. There was no one alive that could remember when cod were common near Omeo or in the big river. There's a few people could remember the last cod round Benambra. And so what could I do? And I got on to a member of the Pendergast family, their original settlers. Margaret Pendergast was her name, and she pulled out a photo about this big of her uncle, Gordon Toland. And he'd gone out horse riding in the early 1930s at the junction of the Gibbo and Mitta Mitta rivers, which is about where the top of Lake Dartmouth is today. And there was a photo of Gordon Toland holding a cod, a small photo, and I scanned it, enlarged it, and it was a trout cod. In fact, Margaret Pendergast told me what her mother's stories and grandmother's stories were, and how her granny used to say, "I can't stand eating these crummy old trout cod up here. They don't have any fat in them like the Murray cod." So whenever they went for a trip to Albury, they had to buy Murray cod, and Margaret said she couldn't stand the fat in Murray cod. The other story that really stuck in my mind was further down the Mitta Mitta River, about where Dartmouth Dam is today. The original town of Dartmouth, or mining settlement, one of the families there was the Mitta family. And George Mitta was in his 90s, and he grew up on the junction of the Dart and Mitta Mitta rivers. And he could go back to the 1920s. And he told stories of cod in their abundance, macquarie perch in their abundance. Occasionally silver perch would punch their way that far up the river. There were so many cod, they just go down, catch them. If they wanted some for the next day, they'd keep them in a mining race. In fact, he told me a story. There was one bloke that worked for their family. After a couple of weeks, he was sick of eating cod. He threw his fishing rod in the river.
I once saw swampy Jack Pendergast in a buggy, catching greasies for bait, and then coming back in the buggy and having a big cod in the back. He'd been down to the Mitta, near where the Gibbo comes in, where the Wombat comes up. He used a light to attract the cod. Although I didn't catch any cod, I was told many stories about them by my family and friends when I was young. I was told when my brother Steve was about 6 years old, he caught a big cod in the Mitta. My dad used to laugh about how my brother used to thread the worms. He was so young he didn't know any better. Well, the one he caught was too long to go in a sugar bag. By my time, the bluenose were less common, though I did catch quite a few when I was very young, about 14 or 15. Then they became scarce. Mr. Murphy told me the Murray cod had taken over from the bluenose. As the bluenose got caught, the Murray cod, being bigger, was the boss. He moved in, took over. He said the Murray cod ate the spawn of the bluenose as he was bigger. I agree. I think the Murray cod took over. The first trout was caught at Dartmouth when I was about 6 years old. The locals didn't think much of them. They thought they were killers. They didn't have a high opinion of them. I saw trout used as a bait for the cod. Later, when the cod and bream got scarce, people started fishing for them. I remember in the late 1920s, certainly by the 1930s, big shoals of hundreds of redfin coming up the river, all 6 inches long. The locals went mad about the redfin, as they thought they were eating all the other fish out. Then the 1939 bushfires killed a lot of the fish.
I remember George telling me one day about the changes he saw, the fish that came and went, the disappearance of trout cod from the Mitta Mitta River, the disappearance of the bream, the Macquarie perch. And I thanked George for his interview, and as I was walking out the door he said, you know, the way things were in the past, those days won't be back, but people should know how it once was. And at that moment I realised that the information on the fish was important, but the history was important, and important to the people recording it. Because you can't preserve people, but you can record and preserve their stories.